This meeting is now being recorded.
And we're going live.
Hello, folks. Welcome to the Rural Cultural Wealth webinar. I'm Matthew Fluharty, Executive Director of Art of the Rural. We are really grateful to have you all with us today. So please take a moment, sit back and settle in. And as folks are joining us over the next few minutes, Savannah Barrett, Director of Rural Urban Exchange at Art of the Rural, will lead us through an intro into the features of Zoom.
Hi, everyone. We're so grateful to have you with us today. Just a reminder, if you haven't used Zoom before, you are able to track everyone who's online right now. So obviously you can see all of the panelists in video here at the top of your screen or as a grid, depending on how you have it set up. You can also see all of the participants. We have 105 right now by clicking on the attendee list. And Sarah Miller just raised her hand, so that's one way that you all can say hey to everyone. Hi, Sarah. We also have a couple of features that you guys want to keep aware of. I'm also going to put this in the chat right now. But we do have a Q&A feature. So if you want to ask a question, you can pose the question anytime. We will address those in the second half of the webinar. You just click on the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom bar of your screen, and just pose a question there. And we will address those, like I said, in the second half of the webinar. If you'd like to join the chat feature, you should have all just received an email from me or a little chat. So I'll say again, hi everyone. And you all are welcome to join the conversation there, talk to one another, introduce yourselves. So I see that we already have some folks chiming in there. So that's not the place for your questions. They will maybe get lost there, but it's a great place to look for links that we're sharing as we begin the webinar. It's a great place to talk to other attendees. You can email everyone by selecting all panelists and attendees. You can email only the panelists, or you can message a particular person. We also encourage you to share your own ideas and examples that are relevant to the conversation. So again, thank you for being with us. Welcome, and I'll turn it over to Chuck Fluharty.
Thanks, Savannah, and welcome everyone. Thanks so much again for joining us. We've really had a huge response to this, and we've got folks from most sectors and colleagues from around federal agencies, which we also very much appreciate. This is really the first public presence for RUPRI's Rural Cultural Wealth Lab, and today we designed this just to provide an overview, give you a bit of how RUPRI got to this juncture, what the background was that led us to this enterprise, talk a bit about the current program of work, and then some discussion of our hopes for the future and how we do hope we might be able to engage many of you collaboratively as we move forward. More about that later, but I'd like to begin by first of all, just expressing deep gratitude for NEA, primarily for their vision in recognizing how important a national lab infrastructure could be in this research space, and then also obviously for their support of our emerging effort. And so to begin the discussion, we're really honored to welcome Sunil Iyengar, who's Director of the Office of Research and Analysis at NEA. Sunil's going to discuss a bit of the rationale in the lab infrastructure design, and a little bit about how our unique lab might play into that mix. So again, welcome Sunil, and thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Chuck. I'm really glad to join you and, of course, all of our colleagues to talk about the NEA Research Lab at RUPRI, the Rural Cultural Wealth Lab. The NEA Research Labs program, just by way of background to everyone, was designed as a way to allow the National Endowment for the Arts to collaborate effectively on building various hubs or resource centers. We call them sort of centers of excellence across the country so that transdisciplinary research teams with arts practitioners can work together to build knowledge about the arts relationship to one of several domains of interest. So other NEA research labs have been awarded to Drexel University, the University of Arkansas, and Vanderbilt University, which involves a research collaboration with Northwestern University. In addition, we're on the brink of announcing 4 more research labs to join this cohort. Topical domains that the various labs will address include the arts and social emotional health and well-being, the arts and cognition, creativity and learning, and the domain being addressed by this lab, the one at RUPRI, the arts, entrepreneurship, and innovation. I should add that the topic of arts, innovation, and rural economic development is one that we at the NEA have explored recently in a research partnership with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, specifically the Economic Research Service there. That effort led to this report, hopefully you can see it up here, which is available on our website and also in the links we've provided for this webinar. I think that's in the chat section. I urge you to take a look as it shows, among other things, the tendency of innovative and productive businesses in rural communities to cluster where there is convenient access to performing arts centers, suggesting a stronger link than we've previously been able to detect empirically between rural arts and economic growth. And I'll just say that ever since our engagement with the folks at RUPRI and their technical working group and others who you'll be introduced to, it's broadened our own understanding here at the NEA about the sort of the deficit of some of the research infrastructure and data needs or data sources that can help to controvert or at least challenge some of the prevailing understanding of creative economies and how rural communities are implicated. So we really look forward to really pushing the envelope here and understanding more about through this comprehensive framework that you'll be hearing about that I know this whole lab is based on, about rural wealth creation. So what will this present lab do? Chuck and his team will explain, but here are 4 products we anticipate developing at this point in time. One is a white paper based on a targeted literature review of existing research and policy models, fostering knowledge at the intersection of rural arts, culture, entrepreneurship, and innovation. 2, an online compendium of existing conceptual models discussing that intersection. 3, an original conceptual framework or theory of change document discussing, inputs, outputs, and outcomes for this domain. And 4, finally, a measurement model based on this framework, highlighting specific needs and opportunities for research, evaluation, and metrics and data sources. It's quite ambitious, but that was, after all, the remit or the goal for these labs in general, the NEA Research Labs program. And we couldn't think of a better partner to engage on this, to embark on this effort with than RUPRI. So I want to thank them and others here, including the technical working group. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Sunil, very much. And again, want to emphasize how important the relationship is with ERS at USDA. Tim Wojin, who's a member of the technical working group and co-authored the study with Bonnie at NEA on the entrepreneurship and innovation dynamic, I think an emerging issue that we'll come back to a bit later. At this point, we decided it's kind of important by way of background to talk a bit about why RUPRI came to this undertaking. I think it really makes perfect sense for everyone to ask, why would a public policy research institute not in the arts and culture space choose to undertake this? It's a really important story, and I think it explains a great deal about our lab approach, our plan of work, and our longer-term vision. Because this lab is now a standing RUPRI enterprise, we are in this for the long haul. RUPRI was founded 3 decades ago by a bipartisan group of senators on the Senate Ag Committee. They asked that we needed, as a nation, to build an external objective source of rural policy assessment, decision support for policymakers, and dialogue facilitation. We're very honored and humbled to have been trying to carry out that mission for the last 3 decades. But early on, as we started this journey, we realized that the rural scholarship is not as deep, the bench is not as broad, and that no one university is really going to have sufficient resources in one place to pull that off. So over time, we've built a very horizontal policy research approach, and the lab has been organized in exactly the same way. Wherever we have done this work, we've tried to do three things. Find really rigorous, evidence-based research expertise, link that with rural policy and practice understanding from practitioners that have a lived rural experience. We think that's just very critical. And then build some kind of a systemic approach for a strategic development process in that space so that you can get enough lead time, because you do have limited capacity and human resources in the research activity to actually have it relevant to public choice. Now, about 10 years ago, as RUPRI's national leadership was discussing what we would do next with our portfolio, we actually began to look at two rural issues that in the last decade have led us to this point. One is the amazing need for next generation leadership in all sectors in rural America. And secondly, how we can begin to inform policymakers about how important arts, culture, and humanities are as an asset to sufficiently entice them to begin investment in that space, because it is critical to place, which is critical to people attraction in place-based policy. Now, we toyed with those things for the first part of the last decade, and then 5 years ago, we decided to build a collaboration with Art of the Rural to create Next Generation. Many of you that are in this space know that Next Generation has a very important theory of change. And that was driven by our belief that in this collaboration, we could get at the intersection of those issues. And it really basically says, it doesn't matter what rural place you are in. If you aren't building a diverse, inclusive, culturally appropriate venue in which the next generation believes they can self-express how their lived experience will contribute, long-term, that place is going to wither. And to acknowledge that and begin to talk about the fact that it's just not tourism and economic activity that we need to think about arts and culture for, but for building the places that are based upon the history, culture, and value system that has kept people there and attracted next generation to it. At the time that was happening, we have a national team of regional economists who were building a new approach to thinking about assets in rural America much more carefully. And it was based on the work that Jan and Neil Fluharty at Iowa State and others were doing around the rural capitals. This led to a new framework in RUPRI, a rural wealth creation framework, which Tom Johnson will talk about here in a bit. We were honored to receive the Lincoln Award from Secretary Vilsack for that a couple of years ago. And that really has become the framework in which we think about most policy dynamics in all sectors. That also aligned in the last decade with early RUPRI collaboration with the Kauffman Foundation in Kansas City, which with other organizations led to the Center for Rural Entrepreneurship, and eventually with the Kansas City Fed, the Center for Rural Innovation. So three knowledge systems were coming together in our germplasm about how we do this. Entrepreneurship and innovation, rural wealth creation as a framework, and rural arts and culture in a next generation setting. Those building blocks were pretty much in place, but we needed to focus it. And to our town national knowledge building grants later from NEA, for which we are eternally grateful, many national partners. This led to a really successful national summit in Iowa City in 2016. We're pleased to announce that we will be following that up with a summit in the fall of next year in the Delta, and following that in the spring of 2019 with a summit relating this work to entrepreneurship and innovation, so that we are moving toward the third leg on that stool. The Rural Wealth Creation Lab is really designed to find the interface in those three knowledge systems to build metrics over time that both describe and eventually signal for policymakers how these relationships work, so that we can deepen the appreciation in public policy for the critical, not non-economic, but place-making beyond economic impacts which arts and culture bring. That's the history of why we are here. It is in changing in a significant way how RUPRI thinks about how we do public policy choice and where the future indeed lies. Much of the national experience we've gone through, frankly, over the last couple of years reflect a really deep need to think much more clearly and engage in much greater transparent dialogue around the unique role that arts and culture plays in rural America, and how that relates to an understanding mutually between rural and urban people about all that. Those are some of our hopes longer term. What's really exciting in all this is the team that we've been able to assemble to undertake this work with us. And in a minute, we're going to ask our immediate team members to say a few words about what brought them to this enterprise. But we're also really, really grateful for an exciting technical working group. And this is actually an international team that has begun to work with us in the last month and will soon be deeply engaged in providing both counsel and, we hope, collaborative interest and collaborative research. And I believe that is scrolling through now, but I want to mention these because it does express the diversity of the research strands that we're trying to unite, and how research and practice must come together at the interface if policy is going to be impacted. We have Linda Essig, Tim Wojin, Bruce Balfour, Felicity Kelleher in Ireland, Maribel Alvarez, Carlton Turner, and Lori Poirier. We're just very, very, very grateful for their engagement and for the breadth of experience that will bring to us as we begin to think about how we move from the lit review to a conceptual model and actually begin the research which will underlay all this. So at this time, I'm going to ask if we could, for the team members that are present today, just to say a bit, if you would, please. We'll let Tom go last, and he can engage the lit review if that works. Kylie, would you kick us off, please?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Chuck. And thanks to everyone who's joined us this morning, and to the NEA for supporting this body of work. My name is Kylie Arroyo. I'm an independent cultural researcher and strategist based in California. I've been working with RUPRI and Art of the Rural for the last 2 years now, both as a founding member of the Next Generation National Advisory Board and also as a senior research fellow with the Cultural Wealth Lab. My research investigates how arts and culture can fuel broad social innovation. So building on what Chuck said, moving beyond just economic development, really to social change, as well as policy entrepreneurship and comprehensive wealth creation. And one of the many reasons I'm drawn to this work and working with this group is to look at how research and the strategies that we develop can help to facilitate greater dialogue and increased collaboration across different geographies, rural, indigenous, and urban.
Kylie, thanks. Really appreciate that. Matt, would you share a bit about your perspective on this?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, I'm Matthew Fluharty, Executive Director of Art of the Rural. I come to this work as a researcher, but also as a visual artist and a writer. And I'm very interested in how we're looking at the intersection of a couple things: culture, place, everyday experience, cultural heritage, and landscape, and how this kind of inquiry can open up an opportunity for deeper collaboration across cultures, disciplines, and geographies. What happens when we really see those connections rise to the surface? What are the opportunities that are there? And I really believe through the inquiry that this lab is undertaking over the long term, we're going to be able to open up a space where we're both considering conceptual and theoretical models while also actively engaging with artists, cultural bearers, and all manner of organizations, policymakers, and community leaders on the ground. The synergistic approach is going to provide us an opportunity through which we can create an integrated and connected vision of the dynamics around these issues, while also providing research products that I feel will be broadly relevant across a really diverse range of folks in the field.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate that. We're very sorry Emily Warnell could not join us. We're excited about her engagement. She's a rural sociologist looking at, among other things, rural livelihoods approaches. And she is working with our State Policy Center at Ball State University. Sam Cordes is traveling at the moment and couldn't join us. And I'd like to suggest then at this point we turn it over to Dr. Tom Johnson, who has taken the lead on our lit review. We're honored to have Tom undertake this task. As many of you know, he's one of our nation's most widely acknowledged regional economists and has been a RUPRI contributor for a number of years and has headed our analytic and academic team for the last decade. So Tom, if you would please, let's talk a bit about what we're learning and where we're headed.
Thank you, Chuck. Thank you for that introduction. And as Chuck said, my research, my current research is really focused on the policy analysis related to rural wealth creation and distribution, especially the role of the cultural capital component of wealth in contributing to prosperity and resilience of the rural people and places. And to date, my key role in the lab has been to really survey the literature. So I want to talk to you about that literature review a little bit. So our goal at the lab is to better understand the nexus of arts and culture, innovation, and entrepreneurship, and how that relates to wealth creation and distribution in rural areas. The literature review, as Sunil pointed out, is just the first step, and it will be the basis for the various products that we will produce in the next few months. One of the keys will be to develop the framework, conceptual framework for understanding how arts and culture, the role that it plays in rural development, and establishing an applied research strategy for the short, medium, and long run. So together, the three knowledge systems that Chuck mentioned cover a very large collection of theoretical and empirical research. You might think of it as a Venn diagram with very large circles for entrepreneurship, for wealth creation, for arts and culture. What we're interested in is looking and finding the essence of that intersection of those knowledge areas. And so this is what we've done. It took a lot of reviewing, but we're zeroing in on those areas. What our review of the research has revealed is that much research on arts and culture has either focused almost exclusively on urban areas, implicitly assuming that arts and culture are essentially the same in rural urban settings, or the research has assumed implicitly that arts and culture is an urban-only phenomena with little or no arts and culture of consequence in rural areas. Of course, we reject the idea that culture is an urban-only phenomena and believe that it is important to understand its characteristics and its role in rural places, especially how that differs from urban. A second conclusion from the literature review is that some, or really much, of the economic-focused research views the arts and culture as just another economic sector, one that creates jobs, income, tax revenue. And to be fair, most of the research does not preclude other values of arts and culture, but this focus on the economics has meant that there's been a lack of attention to these other values, including the role that arts and culture plays in such things as community cohesion, local governance, social innovation, and other the so-called intrinsic values of arts. So while artistic and cultural activities clearly do create jobs and income, this narrow focus undervalues the importance of arts and culture in the lives of rural people and the resilience of rural places. Another finding from the review was that most of the rural-focused research on arts and culture has been in other parts of the world. Europe, Australia, Canada in particular have some very nice research results focused on rural and the rural-urban differential. And while there is much that we can learn from this research, it is critical, we believe, that we learn how arts and culture is similar or different in the rural U.S. as compared to other parts of the world. So finally, the fourth major conclusion is that the Comprehensive Rural Wealth Framework, which we can talk more about, offers a potentially very robust basis for understanding the various dimensions of arts and culture, both their intrinsic and their instrumental values, their role in facilitating inclusive and effective governance, and their role in supporting resilient and prosperous communities. And of course, the Comprehensive Rural Framework, as Chuck indicated, brings together the wide variety of assets that a community has. And we believe that in rural areas, these assets there's a different mix of these assets in rural areas. And so the culture will be complementary and supportive of many other aspects, including nature and human capital and social capital. So this review is just the first step in advancing our goal of better understanding the role and potential role of the arts and culture in improving the quality of life of rural residents and ensuring that rural people and places are contributing fully to the prosperity and sustainability of our entire nation. The literature review has confirmed the important contribution of this new Rural Cultural Wealth Lab and the contribution that it can make. We are excited about the next steps we will take, the development of a robust conceptualization of cultural capital and its place in comprehensive rural wealth, and the articulation of an applied research program that can inform the development strategies of rural leaders, many of whom are on this call. So I'll leave it at that, send it back to you, Chuck, and look forward to all of your questions and comments.
Thanks, Tom. I'd make just a couple points to give primacy to a few issues before we begin the Q&A. One is the literature in this space is very large. Our boat is very small. It's a large ocean. What we're finding is that, as Tom emphasized, there is a significant dearth of rural-focused research in this space. Not a criticism, a reality. Given that, it's extremely difficult right now to begin to articulate a rural differential based on extent research. That's going to point to a serious need for a conceptual model that moves us toward hypothesis testing as we move forward. However, one of the issues that is beginning to play out in policy itself, absent that, is, I think, frankly, a very growing awareness in the arts community. And we're just very, very gratified that Americans for the Arts, National Assembly of State Arts Agencies, NATO, League of Cities, NGA, are all beginning to recognize there is a legitimacy to the question of investing in arts, cultural, humanities work as an essential sine qua non for a placemaking strategy. In fact, when we undertook the collaboration with the Delta Regional Authority over the last year, coming out of our summit in Iowa City, it was just an amazing market test for that question. And we had over 400 communities come together in 6 workshops, and these were elected officials. We're looking at primarily how the public sector jurisdictions might begin to engage arts and culture and begin to think about revenue commitments to that field. Since that time, we're just finding a lot of rural jurisdictions, counties, small towns, cities, regional councils, beginning to actually either share that they have moved to some commitment on their own, or are seeking an understanding of how that might move. We think that even before we begin this research track, the field is moving in that direction. And our hope is, one of the things the lab will be able to do is to lift up the promising practices that are already out there, begin to share those much more broadly. That gets out the final thing that I would share, and then I want to turn it back to our team members just a second, is that we're urging that all of you consider ways in which we might work together moving forward. This is going to be a long journey, and we really would like your counsel regarding how we might work more closely together with you. We have a great diversity of sectors on this call today, but I want to go back and just ask Tom one more question before we go to the ones that are in. Where do you see the lit review moving now, Tom, in terms of how the team will move to some conceptual model, and what do you see as the timeline and the next steps coming out of that to begin any kind of empirical research on the questions that have emerged from that lit review? Share, if you would, on that. I'd ask Kylie to also contribute to that question.
Well, first of all, as Sunil indicated, it will be the basis of those 4 products that we will be producing over the next few months. The literature review will be broken into, like we've done so far, will be broken into parts. One of those will be an interactive website where people can review the various models that have been proposed by other authors. We will produce a document that really describes how the literature lays out the rural differential, both in terms of how arts and culture is seen, but as a basis for economic development conceptually, but also in terms of empirical evidence of those differences. And then we will, I will use the literature review as a basis to wedevelop a series of indicators. The first products will be available in the next 6 weeks or so. Ultimately, the research priorities document will form the basis of a national conference that we hope to hold within the next year or so.
Thanks, Tom. Kylie, any thoughts on that from your perspective?
Yeah, I would just add one thought just to sort of sharpen what's been said so far about the wealth framework. So part of what I find so exciting about this, and I think others will continue to as well, is that the wealth framework, it really fills a critical gap in the infrastructure that is supporting both equitable development as well as public policy making. And what I think is most critical is not just in rural communities, but in urban places as well. In my work in urban America, that absolutely doesn't exist yet. There's pieces of that infrastructure, but it has yet to coalesce into a cohesive whole that can really drive integrated strategy and integrated policy. So while this work is coming out of rural America and informed by and being tested in rural America, it has broad relevance across the country. So I'm really excited to see how we can localize it in different places.
In fact, I'll just add, Kylie and I were pleased to participate in a DC roundtable last month that Americans for the Arts sponsored, looking at where creative placemaking is moving and how we might think more effectively about it. It was largely an urban audience. There were a few rural folks, but I was extremely gratified that the rural wealth creation framework received a tremendous amount of support. And to echo Kylie's point, it was clearly viewed by a number of our urban colleagues as a badly needed methodology, as we need to build metrics for relationships to build decision support for public choice in this area. Matt, did you want to add anything? And we'll get to several questions here that folks have.
Thanks. Sorry, I was on mute. No, just to say that I think the notion of this critical gap in the research and then how the research, this imperative is guiding us, I think is a really productive metaphor for a number of conversations in the next 30 minutes as well. Just to offer that. And I think to say, we're really conscious of, on a conceptual level, there is a critical gap, but also how does that array itself down in terms of what does rural practice look like? What are the gaps there in terms of what we're supporting, how we're talking about it, and the system of networks, whether they're human or research-based, that are there.
Thanks, Matt. And that gets at the beauty of one of our collaborations with Art of the Rural. And in that regard, here's a question that I'll pose to you, Matt. Are we looking at folklorist work, what they've done in rural areas, work around artists, community building, education, health, etc., and how might that community be supportive and how might we engage? Thoughts on that?
Thank you. And thanks to Karen. I think I saw Karen Miller ask that question in the Q&A bar. That is such an important question, and I know for all of us on this call who've been a part of the lab, we've been folks for a long time in conversations who have asked the question, how are we engaging with the folklorist community in these conversations? Because if we're looking, if we truly do believe that there is a critical gap, then the next question is, who are the agents and communities, who are the folks across disciplines who are actually actively working in that gap? And I'm speak only for myself personally, but I feel that really broad panorama of folklore, foodways, and just like vernacular everyday engagement is absolutely the train that we should be looking at. because in so many respects, those are folks on the ground who have built relationships. And there are folks who have listened to and in various ways help cultivate these stories, which are so central to the entire cultural wealth framework when we get beyond just looking instrumentally at wealth.
Could I just weigh in? This is Sunil.
Please, Sunil.
I think that's a very good point. And one of the things I'm hopeful that after Tom's lit review emerges, and I think everyone's on the same page about this, is if we are going to challenge some of the norms for economic value measurement in rural communities, rural settings, I think it's really important to map those assets and to understand who are those practitioners that are not so represented in some of the kind of the conventional models of creative economy that stem largely from urban bases. And again, it's not to be oppositional. I think Kylie made a good point that the work being done in this kind of crucible will hopefully have effects ripple effects on the rural, on our counterparts within the urban settings who are doing this kind of work, measurement work. But I think in terms of research and measurement, it is really important, I think, to give primacy to those who have not been represented within that context of arts and cultural practitioners, arts and cultural assets. So I think that the conceptual framework hopefully will start to make visible some of those elements like folklore, folk foodways, some of these crucial elements to rural culture that may not necessarily be dominant in urban settings.
Excellent comments, Sunil. I'll just add, we hope in a future webinar to talk a lot more about the comprehensive rural wealth framework, but it's led by an understanding that we need to measure what we value, not value what we measure. And getting metrics around that is absolutely essential to be able to do that. And I know this is part of what we want to take on at the summit this fall in the Delta, and it's obviously going to drive the work of this lab. I would just simply say it's going to take a lot more folks, and we do really, really hope that we can build a platform that will enable much, much more to come in that regard, because that just simply is essential if we're going to create a metric. And simply let me say, as in all other sectors where we've worked, until you do that, until that rigorous research is there, the other two things you want to do, informed practice and policy, much, much, much more difficult. In that light, a question from Kentucky, that in recent months, filmmakers have availed themselves of some tax incentives in the state. Is that an option? Are other states doing it? Can we begin to think about that anecdotally? All very important. I'll just say that from where I sit, I'm tremendously encouraged by the work that our jurisdictions of state and local government have initiated, the work NGA has begun to do, the work NATO is doing, and they're coming with a Creative Counties conference in Des Moines in the spring. There's strong support, I think, in both NCSL and NATO, National Association of Development Organizations, around this. But as we traveled, I was just on a webinar with NATO not long ago, three counties with very, very different county size and governance model, all contributing 2 to 10% of their general revenue funds to arts, culture, and humanities development. Pretty significant. And these were not all, by far, urban-based counties. So there is, I think, there is some hope that this is not a bridge too far. I will indicate it's not nearly as broad as we would hope, but the folks that are doing it and measuring it, as Sunil said, are starting to have a much stronger basis for continuing or even expanding that.
Chuck, I'm sorry to interrupt. If I just say one more PS or postscript, I just wanted to say that that was a great question, because I was also thinking that, one of the tools that we are hoping to offer, to Chuck's point about measurement, is we work with the Bureau of Economic Analysis at the Department of Commerce, and we measure the value added by arts and cultural commodities, goods and services to the total economy, the GDP. But we also now are doing that at the state level. I don't think we can, unfortunately, get lower down than that in terms of counties or neighborhoods, but certainly in terms of states, we're getting some data back. And one of the things that popped up the last time we looked at it was Louisiana seems to be doing quite well nationally, and actually a leader, obviously next to maybe California, in film production. And that's really the kind of data you wouldn't necessarily run with. You wouldn't have known about, really, had we not. I mean, not we, but had the government infrastructure been attentive to that. And I think the data infrastructure that we have for measuring economic value. So we will try to do it from here too, on the national level, try to sort of look through the tea leaves and illuminate stuff that could be useful for this lab as you kind of real world test this and think about contexts like Kentucky and other places where, for example, filmmaking is now, where we're looking at filmmaking as a means for economic development.
Thanks, Sunil, very much. Anyone else on the line? We'll move to some other questions. If not, try to get as many as we can today. Okay, let me respond to this one. Sarah asked, I appreciate that this is about research, but can you give a concrete, specific example of how this would help rural artists, arts organizations? For instance, do you expect this research to assist people in getting grants or funding through some sort of focused program? Let me answer that first. RUPRI engages in this work in all our sectors to make a case for the rural differential in public choice. We have to believe that this is a critical component of the national experience, and we do not believe it is being sufficiently funded. We don't believe research is being sufficiently funded. We do not believe practice is. I would simply say, as an example of how this works, and I think it works in multiple levels, you are going to need to aggregate and articulate a rationale for that beyond what we already have. We simply acknowledge that. It's really unfortunate, but it's a reality. We believe that can be done. Secondly, I'll just talk about what the Delta Regional Authority did. Chris Massengale, who was then the federal co-chair, came to the summit in Iowa City. He went back to the Delta and created $1 million program to put a greater number of creative placemaking grants in the Delta. Those grants are ongoing now. We'll be going back with our summit to look at those. We're hoping we'll get metrics off of those. We also have, with every state arts council, with Art Place, in multiple ways, projects going on that are making an impact. Our challenge is to find a way to build a data set that reflects the value add to that place, either quantitative or qualitative work. And that's something the lab needs to be about. It is not an immediate response that says this artist is going to be benefited. I would acknowledge that. But I would say until this sector, and we have tried to work very hard over 30 years to build a rural differential argument in sectors. This is one in which I believe this sector must do this to have a better shot at making the case that the work of the wonderful people doing it every day deserves greater funding. Other thoughts on that, Tom or Matt or Sunil?
Yeah, Chuck, it's a great question, and I think that what this kind of research can do is to better inform local decision makers about the wide variety of benefits from supporting arts and culture in small communities and rural communities, not only in terms of jobs or income, but also its role in creating a sense of community, better governance, more cohesion among people so that they are more likely to get involved in local government. So not only does this have an effect at the national allocation of resources, but in this local support, because it will provide the arts community with the basis for making a very clear statement about the contribution, the full range of contributions that they make to their community.
Thanks, Tom. There was a quick question about the percentage of the rural population in the U.S. and the geographic area. You can choose pretty much whatever geographic definition you want and get another number. Most of those range from 15 to 20% rural population, 80 to 90% geographic land mass of the United States. Just a quick one on that. The next question was, do state arts commissions typically focus on both rural and urban communities? Idaho's Commission on the Arts does, but I've heard other states tend to be urban-centric in programming and funding. Let me take a first stab at that because we've been working in this space now for about a year and a half. And I think it does vary tremendously across time and circumstance. There are states where they take that very seriously. There are states in which I think it is still largely urban-centric. I think all the work that all the organizations I named and all the others, our regional foundations, our national foundations, are beginning to do, I think it is increasing the rural potential within that funding. The other thing I would say is around that, I think it's really significant that the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies is working now with the National Governors Association on a rural arts dynamic. There's just a lot going on in this space that gives me hope that where that it may be the case, we're beginning to change that slowly over time. And I think when state arts councils engage in, to a greater extent, they do see significant benefit. We were honored in Art of the Rural to have worked with the states of Iowa, Kentucky, and Minnesota with their state arts agencies in the work of Next Gen in those three states in building working groups. And we had, I think, tremendous support. That work continues. That work just needs to go on and be continued to be lifted up, acknowledged, and appreciated. I think that will happen. Let me see. Here's a longer question. You talked about public funding. How about philanthropic funding? What percent of that revenue in public funding for the in philanthropic funding for the arts is currently allocated? Does anyone want to tackle that? If not, I will. Let me just say that over time, we have seen a challenge in philanthropic commitment to rural arts and culture. I think we need to name that. I think we also need to name, as I just said, a sea change going on in that regard. And it needs to continue to change, in my opinion. And to the extent that we can do this work, I think it increases the potential of philanthropic boards to be more serious about the rural dimension of their work. But one of the major challenges RUPRI has historically made is that because the public sector funding in community and economic development is significantly less in rural than urban, and that's largely because of community development block grants, it's critical that philanthropy contribute a bit more. And that is starting to happen, but we have a ways to go here. And I think philanthropy is rethinking that. There's a lot of examples out there. I know our regional and state foundations are going in a much stronger direction toward rural arts and culture. Our position would definitely be, we need to help them understand how important that is, and that's part of what the lab's work is about. Any final thoughts on that? And we'll have to close down.
Chuck, this is Kylie. I would just add some numbers to that comment, which I completely agree with. So one of the last national assessments of the distribution of philanthropic funding was done by ERS, so by the federal government. It was done in 2015. And in their findings, they reported that 6% of all grants went to rural-based organizations, arts and culture constituting a smaller portion of that. And that the value per capita in rural geographies was $88 per person. So it was not as though rural communities got the same amount as urban communities per capita. It was actually half of what was distributed to urban communities per capita. So again, the inequity is quite severe.
And I just want to, Sunil here, I just wanted to add that, what Tom was saying earlier about these other values that this model, this rural wealth creation model, we hope will show as guidance for how we can measure and capture this value. Some of those things that Tom mentioned, like community cohesion, some of the other kinds of values that may align more strategically with other funders' portfolio may emerge from this. And I think are things that are not currently being captured. When we say rural arts and culture, we're thinking probably of the foundations that are funding arts and culture first as a starting point, and then within that, what's going to rural communities. But a more comprehensive way will emerge, hopefully, when we hear about these values that are coming out of rural arts and entrepreneurship and innovation. And we may, in fact, see that, look, some of these funders for innovation in general, or some of these philanthropists that are out there, these foundations that are supporting broader initiatives around entrepreneurship and innovation now would take a look, hopefully, at the rural sector as a place to start, once we see what we can get out of this initiative.
And I would add that I think one thing that will come from this research from the lab is a clear profile of what cultural assets are in rural areas and what are important. And it won't be defined so typically urban in nature. And so when we identify this more accurate profile, philanthropists will have an opportunity and then a rationale for supporting things different than they are. And one last point, it is important to keep in mind that a strong rural cultural richness is not just about what rural people benefit from it. It's a benefit to the whole nation to have this full support for rural culture.
Yeah.
Just to say two things in closing, RUPRI has tried to work on this rural differential deficit for 3 decades. I feel more hopeful about it today than I have in a long time, despite the last 15 months in our public culture. I mean that sincerely. I think the fact that all of you were on this call is important. I think we have a lot more work to do. We hope that the lab can begin a series of webinars in the very near future to begin to raise some of these questions. There were other questions raised today. Unfortunately, we're not going to have time for, but we will try to get back to those questions in future labs. I'll just say in closing, the issue about funding is one of the reasons RUPRI has undertaken this work. I believe if you think about this in a systemic, sustained, resource manner around scholarship, move it to practice, and engage policy with it, that is your greatest opportunity for success in this sector. It has frankly worked in the other rural sectors. I believe it'll work here. And that is by way of saying we really, really hope you will join us in this enterprise. We are very young. We have a long-term view of this lab's work, and we hope to collaborate with all of you in multiple ways as we have to date. I'd like to ask if Tom, Matt, Kylie, or Sunil would like to add any final comments, and we'll close her out for today.
Well, I'm looking at some of the Q&A and receiving offers of help, and I would encourage everyone that wants to get involved to send us an email, and we'll get you involved.
Thanks, Tom. Kylie?
Yeah, absolutely. I would second that. And also second what Tom said a minute ago, and something that I've certainly learned, working predominantly in urban places, but now increasingly in rural, is that, our fate is bound up in each other. And the success of rural absolutely has implications for urban communities. So whether you think you care about rural America or not, I think that the arts and culture sector and policymakers have an opportunity to model a very new and more inclusive approach to the way we think about our work.
Thanks, Kylie. Matt?
I'm grateful to be with you all. I think more than anything, what all this suggests is that there are many more conversations to come, and really excited to be with everyone on this call to have those.
I second that, and I'll close out with you, Sunil. Final thoughts, and thank you again for your time with us, Sunil.
Oh no, appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity. We wish the lab continued success, and we are really looking forward to being able to go out and share what we find together, and get feedback and make a better product for the American people. Thanks.
Well, thanks to you all. I echo Matt's final close. We're really looking forward to the next steps together. Thanks so much for your time today. Have a great rest of the week, and we will be back in touch. Please be in touch with us. Thanks so much. Have a good day.